But really, sex addiction is a word that has been going around since the 80s. And now we are trying to change the term because since then, there's been a lot of research in sexology. And now we know that sex is not really an addiction. It's more something to do with impulses and compulsivity, which is really quite different, actually, from an addiction in a clinical sense.
I'm Cindy Darnell. Welcome to The Erotic Philosopher, the podcast where we examine and explore sex and relationships through social, personal, cultural, scientific, political, and other lenses, and unpack and explore your erotic quandaries with the world's wisest erotic philosophers. Today on The Erotic Philosopher, I am thrilled to introduce you to Silva Neves. Silva Neves is a psychosexual and relationship psychotherapist based in the United Kingdom. Silva is a COSRAT accredited and UKCP registered psychosexual and relationship therapist and a trauma psychotherapist. He's also a Pink Therapy clinical associate. He sees individuals and couples presenting with a wide range of sex and relationship issues. And Silva is also the author of Compulsive Sexual Behaviours, a psychosexual treatment guide for clinicians that came out in 2021. Enjoy today's discussion with Silva Neves. Silva, welcome to the Erotic Philosopher podcast. I'm glad that we finally have got the time to be together virtually in the same room.
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me. So nice to see you.
It's so good to see you. So for people listening who are new to me, perhaps, or new to Silva, Silva and I met maybe about 4 years ago, I guess, when Silva was visiting New York City. And he and I have a bunch of colleagues and friends in common, primarily through Pink Therapy. And we've had a wonderful professional relationship ever since. And last year, Silva released, it was your first book?
Yes, that's right.
Tell us about your first book.
It's on compulsive sexual behaviors. It's a book for clinicians, but I try to write it in really, really simple words. So the feedback I got is that people who are not clinicians also got a lot out of it to understand a bit more about compulsive sexual behaviors.
Okay, so let's like just start right from there, because I think a lot of people listening to this are going to maybe have heard the phrase compulsive sexual behavior, but not really know what it means, and certainly not know what it means through the lens that you talk about it. So how would you describe, what is a sexually compulsive behavior?
Yes, that's true. Actually, most people will have heard of the term sex addiction, and I think most people will know the term sex addiction compared to compulsive sexual behaviors. So, but really, sex addiction is a word that has been going around since the 80s, and now we are trying to change the term because since then, there's been a lot of research in sexology. And now we know that sex is not really an addiction. It's more something to do with impulses and compulsivity, which is really quite different, actually, from an addiction in a clinical sense. So now we're calling it compulsive sexual behaviors.
Okay. And so an example of a compulsive sexual behavior might be, what would you say would be an example that people could relate to?
Sure. Well, it's really, most people think it's about having a lot of sex, but actually it's not that at all. It's about not being able to control strong impulses that then result into some unwanted sexual behaviors. So it's really something to do more about impulse control rather than the number of times you have sex or the number of times you masturbate. And part of the criteria diagnostic that is really important is that it should not be something that an external source disapprove of. So, for example, if you read a book that says it's bad to watch pornography, and then you think, oh my gosh, I'm a sex addict because I watch pornography as a result of a book's opinion, then that cannot be diagnosed as a compulsive sexual behavior because it's an external disapproval. So there has to really be something about you feeling distress internally about your own sexual behavior, regardless of what other people think.
Okay, so it's a really internally generated position about that the person seeking the support is the person who thinks that they have a problem, not the partner saying, I think you're a sex addict, I think you have compulsive sexual behavior.
That's right. Yes. And also there has to be something that it has to be unwanted, obviously. So it has to be a person that says, I'm just not liking what I'm doing. And it has to be a behavior that lasts for more than, on a repetitive basis, that lasts for more than 6 months. And the reason for that is because a lot of people that have had something terrible happen in their life, for example, a very big, important bereavement, might have some compulsive sexual behaviors for a short period of time, like maybe 2 or 3 months, to manage the very strong emotions of the bereavement. And then it just wanes by itself after a time. So that's not classified as a disorder. It's a normal process of how people manage very big emotions.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, given that, for people like you and I who have had the training to be able to separate, behavior from identity, from impulses, from, the stories that the media throw out to us. How is it, do you think, that, if we go back to how you say the term sex addiction sort of started getting thrown around in the media in the 80s, how do you think it came to be that as a collective, as clinicians, but also just as regular people, how did we get so lost along the way that we started taking this term that was made up by the media that's now become a diagnosis, and I use that word very loosely, a diagnosis that people will accuse each other of? It's almost like, calling somebody a witch. You're a witch, I'm going to report you. So you're a sex addict, I'm going to report you. You're going to lose your job. You're going to have your kids taken away. How did we get to this point?
Well, I think the short answer is that it's easy. It's easy to point the finger at somebody else with some people having sexual behaviors that you might morally disagree with. It's easy to point the finger and say, you're a sex addict, you have a problem. And most of the time, of course, people don't have a problem. They just have different, sexual behaviors, really. But the term started in the 80s because also that's the time of the HIV epidemic. And that's, I think, a very important thing for people to understand is that at the time, because of the HIV epidemic, when people thought, clinicians thought, well, here is this person who has sex, puts themselves in danger and risk of death, because at the time it was, and cannot stop this behavior. It must be an addiction. Because at the time, there wasn't a lot of sexology knowledge at the time. So the only other knowledge that we knew was alcoholism and drug addiction, which is basically a repetitive behavior, doing something that you can't stop, that can cause big harm, physical harm. So because that was the only thing that we could compare it to, people were thinking, well, surely it's the same on the surface. It's the same. It looks the same. Therefore, it must be an addiction. And it's not been questioned ever since. Although now, because of so much knowledge that we have in sexology, sexual behavior studies, and so on, all of the international scientific communities are saying there is no evidence of an addiction disorder. So it is not an addiction. But despite all of the science, the term really stuck because it's an easy term. It's something that people can just throw around, and there's not been enough, to be fair, enough clinical thinking about it. I think the public also, there's a difference between the public language and the clinical language. So in the public language, the word addiction is thrown around all the time. I'm a chocolate addict, I'm a Netflix addict, I'm a cheese addict, whatever. And when people say that, what they mean is I might be doing a little too much of something I enjoy.
So it's sort of erring towards, this is a behavior that could get me into trouble, or it's what you're saying. It's something that I'm enjoying it too much. But I wonder if there's an element of it because there's enjoyment attached to it in our collective psyche that means that it's bad, like that.
Well, yes, and I
Piggybacking
think,
on the idea that pleasure is bad.
yes, absolutely, because for some reason, a society is not very comfortable with the idea of pleasure. So, but when it comes to, saying something lightly like I'm a chocolate addict, people can talk about this, they can smile, and they understand, oh, yes, I love chocolate, but sometimes I'm doing it a bit too much, and then I feel like putting on weight, and that's not so good. But people can have this conversation quite lightly, and they're not going to point fingers at people, and nobody really feels bad, or nobody goes to therapy because they're like, I'm eating too much chocolate. Of course, unless they have an eating disorder, but that's different. But as soon as the topic is about sex, you replace chocolates with sex, and suddenly it becomes this very dark thing where people think, oh, you must have such a dark problem, you must be so bad and so wrong. Because on top of society not being very comfortable with pleasure, society is also very, very uncomfortable with anything that's sex or sexual. And because it makes people really uncomfortable with themselves, then what they prefer to do is to say, I'm not like that. That's other people. And then they point the finger and they put a label on it like sex addicts.
Yeah. And in your experience, given that there is so much scientific clinical data now to confirm that one cannot be addicted to sex in the same way that one cannot be addicted to sneezing or to, picking their nose, even though, we might do it as a nervous response, we might do it as an impulse. Why do you think that there are still so many, so-called sex addiction treatment centers, particularly in the United States? I'm not sure if they exist in Europe as well. How is it that these places still get away with functioning, do you think, given that there is so much clinical data to the contrary about the processes that these places put people through?
Well, because they make money. And they make a lot of money out of it. And so they have a great investment in continuing to perpetuate the term and continuing to perpetuate all this narrative about sex addiction and porn addiction, despite the science. And really, it's kind of like the only other thing I can equate it to is religion, actually, to be fair, because religion is this other process where people just do not like science. It's inconvenient because so they prefer to keep their story despite the science. And the sex addiction field, unfortunately, is doing the same, perpetuating the same story for financial gains. And in the US, as you said, there's plenty of clinics like this that specialize in sex addiction, meaning their sole income relies on sex addiction and people believing they're sex addict. And in the UK, we have a few, less. Also, the country is smaller, much smaller. But we have a few clinics that specialize in sex addiction who rely 100% on the term sex addiction for surviving financially. So then, of course, when you have stories that says, oh, there is a surge in porn addiction since the pandemic, actually, the research says otherwise. But those people that say, oh, there's all these porn addicts now since the pandemic, are the people who sell the programs for porn addiction. So,
how convenient. Isn't that the first rule of business, that you identify the problem and then you sell them the solution?
That's right.
And it's so interesting. And so, now that you've got this book now, and you've also, you're sort of quite visible in the media, particularly in the UK, talking about this topic. What has the response been like to the fact that you're coming out and saying all of this hoo-ha that we've believed for the last 30 years is not only untrue, in some cases it's flat out lies, and this is the clinical evidence, this is the data, and this is actually how we as therapists and sexologists and counselors and coaches and whatever else, this is how we can instead look at this particular issue from a more compassionate stance, from a more scientifically informed stance from a more sex positive, pleasure positive stance. What's the response been from the media at one level and then from other clinicians?
Well, divided, obviously, but I have to say the response has been really, really amazing and really great. And a lot of people have been saying, oh, thank God, finally a book that's looks at the problem in a different place, looks at the problems from a sex positive lens. I've even had quite a few sex workers who read my book and said, the only book that's not homophobic, thank God, right? And I've had a lot of people that have been talking about sex positivity and people that are in the sexology side, which now is a growing clinical space. And so the book has been very welcome from this side. And from the people that are on the addiction side or the sex addiction side, so far they have ignored my existence, most of them. So they prefer not to talk about it. I did have a few people actually that have congratulated me from the sex addiction side, who have congratulated me for publishing my book, which is very nice and pleasant, because in the UK we are not so we're not so forward, I guess, from America. So we can say nice things even if we believe otherwise.
Well, I mean, I guess it's nice at least that even if they don't agree with you, that they can see the depth of your research and your expertise in the area, that they cannot, if it's a difference of professional opinion, I guess, people can think what they like. But the fact that you can make these claims actually based on science and data and not just what somebody at the pub told you, I think, certainly makes a really big difference, particularly for somebody at your, professional level.
Yes. And I have to say, there's a lot of people from stateside, who I admire greatly, who have really helped me understand compulsive sexual behaviors away from sex addiction. So there is a great movement in the US as well. I'm so happy to say I'm not alone in this. There are quite a few of us who are talking against sex addiction. So in
the last season of The Erotic Philosopher, I interviewed Doug Braun-Harvey, who is one of the lead thinkers in this field as well. And, he has a book that he's written, again, for clinicians through the American lens. But the American lens does tend to be very focused on religion. Is it the same, do you find, in Europe and other parts of the world that don't have the strong religious influence in the way that the US does?
Yes, in the UK, certainly, and in Europe, there's a less religious influence, as in it's less overt. But what I find in the UK is that the people that tend to be very vocal to promote porn addiction and sex addiction tend to be covertly religious. But
that's really interesting.
Yes, but they don't like to say it openly. So they might say, I'm sex positive and everyone can come to my clinic because I'm secular and I work with everybody. But actually, if you read their text, the books that they write, there is, talking about God and prayers and all that stuff.
Yeah, which is really embedded in the addiction narrative, isn't it? It's about, if you surrender yourself to God, then everything's going to be okay.
That's right, which is also quite it's a 12-step tradition, really, which is one of the main kind of addiction models. And that is very problematic for me because in some ways in the US, if people are more overt about it, people can choose. They can say, oh, this person or this clinician is really religious. They're going to do a religious treatment. So I'm not going to go there, or I am going to go there if they share the same religion. In the UK, my very big problem, and that's one thing I talk about a lot, is that clients don't necessarily understand what they are going to be entering into. They're not, they can't really fully consent because they're not always aware that when clinicians say, yes, I will treat this as an addiction, or yes, I recommend that you go to 12-step programs, they don't always understand that this is a religious guidance place.
Yeah, I think that is really omitted from the brochures that they leave around in doctors' clinics and stuff. They don't say that. So people thinking that they're going to sex addiction rehab think that they're going into a secular environment when they may not actually be.
Absolutely, and they're really not. And despite what 12-step programs say, we don't prescribe to any religion. These are also lies, because it just doesn't take long. If you actually read the texts, it doesn't take long to see the word God all over the place. But also in clinical books, written by British experts on sex addiction, they also write religious stuff in it. And I'm thinking, this is really strange, because if you think about it, I've not really seen any other clinical books, like a book on OCD or eating disorders or depression or anxiety. I never seen experts say, yes, and if you pray, then, it's an intervention. It's a viable intervention. But in sex addiction, somehow that gets through.
That's such an interesting thing. And I mean, my observations also is that I notice the people who either get labeled or label themselves as sex addicts or porn addicts tend to be men. Is this overwhelmingly a men's problem?
It's not a men's problem, but it's targeted. The sex addiction narrative is targeted at men, because it's very uncomfortable to think of a woman having a vibrant sexuality. So that's like not looked at.
It's very uncomfortable. You can see how uncomfortable I am.
Yeah. So, women are labeled love addicts because it's less offensive.
Yeah, right. I mean, I know I've seen here in New York, certainly, before the pandemic, maybe it's still going, but, some like these support groups, Love and Sex Addicts Anonymous sort of things that I was like, wow, love and sex addiction now. I was like, how are you addicted to love? Like, I mean, I know that there was a song in the 80s, but, it was the song. It's not real life. But now it's this, you can be addicted to love. I feel like, I love my dog. I mean, maybe I have a love addiction because I'm completely in love with him. But
well, exactly. I mean, it's incredible, isn't it? Love is such a powerful life force, and it's something that we all strive to love and to be loved. And why is it an addiction now? I mean, goodness, those people just coming up with those terms, they must have really joyless lives.
Right. And it just, it comes back to, this notion, I guess, of when you can control people, when you can control their sexuality, when you can control their sexual expression, then it's kind of like you can control every aspect of their lives, which I guess is why so many of the world's major religions have a lot to say about sex, how it should be done, who gets to do it, who doesn't get to do it, when you do it, when you don't do it, what the right reasons are, what the wrong reasons are. There's a lot of kind of, moral policing about sex and who gets to do it and not do it. And I guess, to a degree, there's also this moral stuff around clothing and food and all of these kinds of things. But it really is how if you can control someone's, erotic relationship to being alive, then you really control everything. And in doing that, certainly where they're targeting men with this, it's really, it has the same effect as religion.
Yes, it has. And the another thing about sex addiction that I find very disturbing is that they confuse compulsive sexual behaviors with sexual offending. And again, when you think of sexual offending, you think of men mostly, because male sexuality is dangerous. And actually, we see that in the media, especially in America, all these celebrities that actually sexual offend. And where do they go? They go to a lovely, expensive sex addiction clinic.
Yes.
So, and I'm thinking, well, if they are sex
to eat
offenders,
organic food and get massages.
Yeah, I'm thinking, if they are sex offenders, surely they should go to a sex offense clinic. But that's a little less glamorous, isn't it, for celebrities?
Right. That's a really powerful distinction, actually. That to confuse. Being a sex criminal with being a sex addict, that they're just completely worlds apart.
Yes. But because of the addiction narrative, it's kind of like the addiction narrative is in drugs and alcohol. We see that certainly where it's like the tolerance. You've got to keep doing more and more and more for the same high, and so the fear narrative that brings people to the clinics in sex addiction is to say, oh yeah, you've got sex addiction now, and if you continue, you're going to become a sex offender. So, and that's like
that's the
big
real
fear
slippery
thing.
slope, isn't it?
Yeah,
That,
right.
If you don't pull it together, you're going to end up in jail.
Yes, absolutely. But I really do want to say that, people who struggle with compulsive sexual behaviors do sexual behaviors that are adult behaviors with consenting other adults. So most are not sex offenders. And I really want to make the difference between compulsive sexual behaviors and sex offenders. It's two completely different problems.
Yeah, I hear you. And I really appreciate that distinction. So I have a letter from a listener here that I think really fits in with your knowledge base and your area of expertise. Would you be willing to help out this person with their problem?
Of course.
All right. Dear philosophers, I'm hoping you can help me. I'm a gay man in a relationship with a beautiful man for 2 years. We met at a sex club and started hooking up regularly. After a while, I guess you could say we caught feelings and have been officially partners since the start of the pandemic. I love him, but the problem is I don't want to be monogamous. He's very good at monogamy, and even though I've tried to tell him I like the freedom to have hookups, he doesn't understand it, and he tells me that he thinks I'm a sex addict. I don't know if I am or not, but I'm scared that if he catches me cheating on him, it will confirm that I am a sex addict in his mind, and he will leave me. I love him, and I want to be non-monogamous. What should I do? And that, Silva, that's from Lawrence. Do you have any advice for Lawrence?
Sure, of course. This is such a common story that I hear all the time. And so really, first of all, no, you're not a sex addict. Let's just start there.
Okay. I thought you were going to say that. I also didn't think he was a sex addict, but I wanted to check what you thought too.
Yes. And also this is another thing about sex addiction that people often, and that's part of the 12-step movement, people feel like they have to identify as it. I am a sex addict, rather than saying I struggle with sexual behaviors. That's quite different. So I would first advise Lawrence to say, don't identify with it. You're not anything other than a human being, right? With erotic feelings and relational feelings, and you never caught feelings. You've always had feelings, and but the thing is that you're trying to make sense of them for you, and also in relation to the partner that you currently have. Now, most of the time, when people say, oh gosh, I'm a sex addict, that comes to my clinic with the same kind of stories, it's not that at all. It's just that they have, I said just, it's not simple, is that they have an erotic conflict. And the erotic conflict is something to do with the actual person's erotic, what we call erotic template or erotic mind, right? So the things that turns people on and the things that really awakens the sensuality and the erotic. And that is so diverse from one person to the next. And one person's turn on can be another person's turn off. So it's really important to understand for yourself, what is it that turns me on? And the conflict is that sometimes what turns you on is not really something that turns on your partner or that's compatible with your partner. So for many people that say, I just don't want to be monogamous because I just enjoy hookups, is because it's part of their turn-ons. It's part of excitement. It's part of feeling alive. And it meets really important sexual, erotic, and relational needs, because even a hookup is relational. So, but he happened to fall in love with somebody who is monogamous. So again, it's not somebody who's good at monogamy, because when you start to say that, and language is so important, I find, when you say, oh, my partner is good at monogamy, what that implies is like, I'm not good at monogamy, meaning I'm the wrong one. I should be better at monogamy. And monogamy is just not something that you learn. It's just something that you either enjoy and you thrive in, or you don't. And monogamy or polyamory or anything else in between, they are not just things that you can get a license for. It's whatever you thrive in, and they're all at the same level. Not one is better than the other. But in our world, often we think monogamy is gold standard, and you should be better in monogamy, and that's just not that at all. So really, to manage this conflict that Lawrence is in at the moment, it's not to apologize for his non-monogamy, but at the same time, to feel good about himself is to not go into the place of an ethical non-monogamy. And what I mean by that is that when you cheat, meaning that you have sex with other people... Which is what
he says he's doing. He says he is cheating.
Yes. When you cheat, it means that you are taking away the rights of your partner to make their own informed decisions about their sexual health. So... And of course that hurts both people, because the person who cheats often feel guilty about it as well, and they don't like it. And I guess that's why Lawrence wrote this letter, because he feels bad about himself. But that the feeling bad about himself is not as a result of a sex addiction disorder, is as a result that he's doing non-consensual non-monogamy, so unethical non-monogamy, because he really needs to meet his sexual needs that his partner disapproves of.
Yeah. And I've seen, like, this situation with Lawrence, I've seen in so many different kinds of couples, straight couples and gay couples, and and then even also actually in with couples who are already non-monogamous and they already have an agreement around non-monogamy, that still, this sort of cheating can occur even in non-monogamous relationships, because it's about not being able and willing to, be able to talk about what's really going on for one or both people, that one person feels like they have to hide it, they have to sneak around because of shame, because the other person doesn't approve, because of some other prior agreement that they'd made years ago, and they either haven't readdressed it, or there's so many reasons why people can end up in this situation. But like with what's Lawrence's problem is that his partner now is saying you're a sex addict, which, according to what your definition is around, we know it's not actually an addiction. We know well, in this case for Lawrence, is it a compulsive thing? You're saying it's not even a compulsive thing for him. For him, it's more of it's what he likes. He wants to be non-monogamous.
That's right. Yes, because that's what he clearly says. He says, I want to continue hookups. That's what I want. So it's not even compulsive, because most people with genuine sexual compulsivity, they often say, I have no idea what I'm doing this. I don't want to do this. It makes me feel bad. I have no idea why. But Lawrence knows why. He likes it. He enjoys it. He wants it.
Yeah. And he also wants to have an intimate, loving, partnership that is fulfilling in the ways that I guess a hookup scenario doesn't offer the things that a long-term partnership offers, and he wants to be able to have both of those.
Yes, and it is possible to have both if everybody agrees.
Okay, and I think that's the next part of this. So if Lawrence and his partner were to show up in your clinic one day, how do you think you would approach it? How would you guide them as a couple?
Well, first I would say, how did you decide to be monogamous? Because a lot of people don't.
That's a really powerful question.
Yes, because a lot of people sleepwalk into it because they think this is the thing to do. If you want to be in a relationship, this is the way to be, and they don't realize that there are many, many different types of relationship setups. So often they will look at each other and say, "Oh, we never really discussed it," or "Oh, don't know." And so I would start there. And then then we open the space for different options. And often the thing about the threat about not being monogamous is the threat of being left, the threat that the partner is going to meet someone better and they're going to be left. And so then I start to look at why they're feeling this way. And sometimes often it is because they feel insecure with themselves in the first place. And they might have a bit of an anxious attachment style, for example, where they just feel like, if I don't have my partner all to myself, it means that I'm not good enough in some ways. So it's looking at all of the underneath layers that informs a person's feelings about behavior, sexual behaviors, what love means, what attachment means, what intimacy means, because those things mean so many different things to different people.
And it's so much less about, the person with the desire to be non-monogamous, or the person with the higher libido, or the person with the stronger yearnings, let's say, that they don't necessarily have to be the one that brings everything down. It can be that the other person lifts their game up a little bit as well, rather than, the out of control person is so out of control that they need to be corralled in. It sounds like it's a bit more of a balancing act.
Yes, exactly. And one of the things I would suggest from the very beginning is to say, let's just not point fingers, because that is corrosive to a relationship. So as soon as you point a finger and one says you're a sex addict, but sometimes it goes the other way. The other person might say you're boring, right?
Yes, right. You're boring, you're frigid,
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So pointing fingers is never good. It just destroys a relationship. So instead it's about, okay, let's just look at what is. Let's explore each other's erotic mind. Let's explore if as out of all the turn-ons, are there some that are compatible? And also looking at the rest of the relationship, because sex is not everything. What about the love that they've created, the home they've created, the shared history and memories they've created? That also is important. And sometimes, and then it's really to look at the partner and to say, now, given all that I know about my partner, about the love, the intimacy, what I get, what I don't get, what I like, what I don't like, do I choose to be with that person? But actively, affirmably choosing to be with that person. Because when we choose to be with someone, we can't cherry pick what we like or what we don't like. If we choose a person, we choose them with all of their qualities, all of their flaws, all the things that we love and all the things that we wish they didn't have and still have to accept.
Yeah. No, it's absolutely true. It's right. And so, like, for someone like Lawrence who's been cheating and now is feeling bad about it, does it feel like, should he stop the sneaking around business? Should he, how should he approach it? Should he suggest to his partner that they go to couples therapy and that he should fess up about these cheating things he's been doing, or should he keep it to himself? What do you think about that?
I think that if he wants to stop being unethical and being in ethical relationship, yes, he should stop cheating, but he needs to commit to himself that he's not going to be sneaking around behind his partner's back, and instead address the problem right there and then in couples therapy or in his own one-to-one therapy. And the stop cheating does not mean he has to stop hooking up. It just means that he has to just pause for a little while until he's in a relationship that is in ethical, where everybody agrees. But what it means also is that he has to be honest with himself first, to really get to know his erotic mind first before he can actually share that with his partner, and then they can start again, either with this person or maybe with somebody else. I don't know. His authentic sexual life when he doesn't have to hide or to sneak around. But if he continues to cheat, and often people who cheat on a regular basis, they eventually get found out. And if they get found out, it's going to really hurt their partner very much. The person that he loves is going to hurt his partner, and he's going to feel even more shame and even more guilt for himself. So pointing fingers is not good, but also cheating is not good. But it's not really about, I have to beat myself into becoming monogamous. It's just, okay, let me look at what I've got here, what I want, what I like, and let's have those conversations, because deep erotic conversations, people don't often know how to have them, because again, we don't grow up with that kind of education.
Yeah, that is such an important point. People don't know how to talk about sex. And, I mean, one of the phrases that I use a lot is people need to learn to talk about sex like it matters. And they don't, they just don't, because of this story that we've all been spoon-fed, that sex is natural. When you're with the right person, it's just effortless and it all flows, and it doesn't require any work. It doesn't require any compromise. It doesn't require anything. It's all just, when you're with the right person, it all just magically happens. And if it's not the right person, you'll know, because it'll be difficult. And it's not true. And we don't know how to talk about it. We don't know how to separate sex from love. We don't know how to separate sex from intimacy. We don't know how to talk about our feelings. We don't know how to talk about our desires without it becoming this pathology. And, this is just so true for so many people. And even though we're living in a world where you can get sex information 24/7 on the internet, it's just, there's so much information everywhere. People are still really screwed up and scrambled in their heads about all of this stuff.
Exactly, because there are more misinformation out there than actual real information. And people like you and I and all of our sex positive friends, we hear the same stories. Sometimes we have to shout so loud to give accurate information, because there's so much misinformation noise about sex and relationships. But yes, learning to have this deep erotic conversation with your partner is really, really essential. And the way that I try to tell my clients to make it a little bit simpler for them, or maybe less scary, is to say that it's like becoming a gastronome, like becoming your own 5-star Michelin chef. It's like you have lots of ingredients. Your erotic mind is full of ingredients. Your partner's erotic mind is full of ingredients. Then what dish are you going to make today? And there's plenty of things that you can do, but do it together. And every day you can actually make something different.
Yeah, absolutely. And you have to be committed to doing that. And I think, that's one of the really interesting things too, that I say to the couples that I work with, when one is presenting with some sort of, problem, let's say, a sexual, compulsion thing, or they want to be non-monogamous or whatever it is, that the implication is the person who, the problem is one person's fault. And if only that person would change, then we would both be fine. But it's, they always
so
say this.
Common.
And if you could only blah, blah, blah. And the issue that, the thing that I say to the couples I'm working with, if one person has a problem in the relationship, then you have a relationship problem. It's not just a you problem. It's an us problem. Even if it feels like it's a you problem, it's always about the two of you, because if you want to continue being in a relationship, you're going to have to deal with this issue relationally through the lens of, getting both of your, not necessarily needs met. You can't get all your needs met necessarily in one relationship, but you can certainly advocate for yourself and talk through compromises and solutions that might be a bit outside the square.
Exactly. And because of that, also, if one person changes in the relationship changes as well. So rather than pointing the finger at the partner, try to change yourself first and see how it changes the relationship, and see how your partner responds to you changing. And because if you are the one wanting the change, well, start by changing yourself and see how that goes.
And that's where this kind of sex therapy can be an individual process as much as it is a couple's process.
Yes, exactly. And so for Lawrence, imagine if he could feel integrity with himself. If you could feel in integrity with himself, to think, so he stops cheating. He feels better about himself because he's not doing something behind his partner's back. How much more comfortable will he be to have a conversation, an erotic conversation with his partner, to be able to be open about it? Because at the moment, maybe he's not able to do that, because he thinks, if I start a conversation like this, maybe I'm going to get found out. So he just retracts and keeps hiding.
Yeah. And then the problem gets worse and worse, and it goes underground. And then he
5 years of cheating and he can't say anything to anybody because there's too much water under the bridge.
I know, exactly. And there's one thing that is quite controversial because not everybody agrees, but what I do say, if somebody stops cheating and they absolutely commit to themselves that they won't cheat again, if, say, 1 or 2 months later, the partner asks, have you cheated? It's okay to not fess up.
I agree. I know it's controversial, but I agree with you.
Yes,
because
for the health of the relationship,
yeah.
and to spare the partner's heart that he loves very much, if he commits to not do it again, I think it's okay not to fess up.
I think so too. It's sometimes the act of confessing causes more problems than it solves, and it in some situations it can be okay. But in many situations, to fess up after doing, whatever you've been doing, it can just cause so much hurt that can be avoided.
Yes, if you get a sexually transmitted infection, then of course you've got to say it, right? Because that's for your partner's health. But if not, this thing of having to fess up, it comes from this idea of transparency. In order to be in a relationship, you have to be transparent. And I disagree with that too, because if you're transparent, then where is the erotic? Sometimes with the erotic, you need to keep something behind a little bit for later, for a bit of a surprise. But also this transparency comes from, I believe, this religious undertone of having to, a couple needs to have no secrets, a couple have to be together. And that's the sanctity of marriage that kind of gives that kind of messages. And now we don't understand any longer that's actually quite a religious one. And we think it's an important part of relationship health. But actually, transparency can cause a lot of problems and it can kill sex life.
Absolutely. And so I'm interested, as we sort of just start wrapping up this conversation, Silva, for you having a French background, living in the UK, but then also having a lot of dealings professionally with the United States, do you see differences between, particularly French culture, which is notorious for, its kind of very liberal appreciation of all things erotic, in contrast with the Brits, who are, pretty kind of uptight and stiff upper lip, but quite kinky and into spanking and all the stuff that the Brits get into with their bowler hats. And then in contrast again with the Americans, who are either, at swinger clubs and just, letting it all hang out, making porn and doing all the things, or they're just, sitting in a church praying, hoping that it all blows over. How do you see the cultural, and certainly like where I'm from Australia, where everything is a little bit, oh, don't worry about it, she'll be right, mate, is what they say in Australia, which is what we'd say when we don't want to deal with anything. So how do you find these cultural things play out, certainly with the French being so liberal around marriages, people having affairs and all this kind of stuff? I mean, is that just a myth? And is this a big topic in continental Europe as much as it is in the UK?
It's not such a big topic in continental Europe, but it is still a thing, but for much less intensity. So, for example, there's no sex addiction clinics all over the place like there is in the US or even in the UK. They just consider it as a sexual behavior problem rather than just, pathologizing it to death. But in France, it's a myth that French people are very liberal about the sex life, because they're not.
Oh, is it?
I know.
That's disappointing. I thought the French had it all worked out.
No, they're very into marriage, very into monogamy. Still very very binary in their gender roles.
Not the French people I know.
Yeah, well, maybe you hang out in the best places.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, but as a general culture, it's very still monogamy and marriage oriented. But the thing that the French do have is that they do not apologize for their pleasure. And they love their pleasure.
Interesting.
Yes, they love taking time for pleasure, whether it's food or sex or whatever. That's part of an important part of the culture. And that's the difference, I think.
That is Yeah, a really profound difference. I was just thinking about in Australian culture how that plays out, because Australians are quite pleasure oriented also. It's not uncommon for Australians to take a day off to, go to a sports game or to just, go to the beach or whatever, that it's embedded in the culture to take a day off work to do something fun. Not all the time, but you can do that, and people, it's sort of okay. But to take a day off to stay home and have sex, I don't think would be especially encouraged in Australia, because that pleasure thing in Australia is, pleasure is fine as long as it's sport, barbecues, beaches, all that stuff, no problem. If it's about sex, then Australians get a bit funny about that too.
Yes, and the other thing in France that's very strong is the secular culture. So anything to do with religion, even a hint of religion, it's a turnoff for French people. So that's why the sex addiction, as the way that we know it in England and in the US, didn't really take off so much because of all of the religious messages, and the French people can really, they can really hear that very well. So then they're like, as soon as they're like, oh, pray, oh yeah, forget it. It's I'm not doing that. So, but in England, there's a lot of apologies for pleasure for some reason. English people find it, as a general rule, find it very difficult to admit openly to say, I am having a cup of coffee and I'm loving it.
That's I've noticed that with the lovely old Brits, that that pleasure's still a dirty word in Britain. But then on the other side of the fence, they're all they have some of the best kind of kink and BDSM clubs.
Yes,
in the UK.
That's really wonderful about Britain.
Yeah,
and that's
such a contradiction.
That's the beautiful contradiction, that there's such a strong kink and BDSM scene in England, which is amazing. And I think that might just go with the kind of like prohibition, the Victorian prohibition that we had in the Victorian time, and it's maybe something that is a big turn on to violate those prohibitions that are ingrained in the English psyche. So yes, and America is fascinating. America, isn't it? America is a bit bipolar with the places on the coast when you have amazing sex positivity, amazing progressive sexuality and relationships, and then in the middle you've got all the churchy.
It's like it's its own entity. It's sort of, the United States, to me, they're not very united. Like they're just, there's so much diversity: north, south, east, west, the middle, the top, the bottom. Like everything is just, culturally, each sort of zone. And where I am here in New York in the Northeast, it has its own sort of flavor, which tends to be more progressive and liberal and permissive. But not too far south of here, it starts to become, very Christian and evangelical and conservative, and then that really inhibits the way that people can express pleasure for all things, especially sex. So
yes, and tell me if I'm wrong, but what the image that I get from the US is that in US people can be really aggressive and really attack other people. If they have different views, compared to in the UK, people have different views, but they tend to not want to make a fuss too much. But in America, I hear people being really unpleasantly attacked. If they bring the word of science, for example.
Yeah, I think things have gotten especially divisive here since the rise of the election before the last election, sort of since 2016, if you know what I'm saying. So. That whole political upheaval, I think, really split a country that was already a bit fragile anyhow. And so that political uprising, then now combined with the pandemic and the people who have opinions about vaccinations, has really, everything just seems so divided here. And also in my home country, Australia, things are equally divided there for similar reasons, oddly enough, that America and Australia are starting to kind of, they've always had a close kind of symbiotic relationship, but culturally, Australia is seems to be starting to morph into America in some ways, which unfortunately, it's taking some of the bad qualities of America, I think, not some of the good qualities.
Yes.
So.
See, sometimes societies or history just repeats itself rather than just evolving.
Right. Silva, I could talk with you all day and all night, but unfortunately, we do have to wrap this up now. So I'm going to put links to you in the show notes. Are there any things that you would like listeners to know about, any project you've got coming up, any offerings you have, anything at all that you would like to alert listeners' attention to before we wrap up?
Just if you're interested in sex positivity, in sexology, in LGBT content as well, you can follow me on Instagram. I just post things on there, or Twitter. I just post lots of things, and that's about it. It will be really nice to meet you.
Great. Silva, it was so wonderful to catch up with you, and I look forward to seeing you in real life again, maybe this year, maybe next year.
Yes, I am planning a USA trip as soon as I can.
Oh, fantastic. I'm hoping that I can get to England sometime soon too.
Yes.
I hope you enjoyed today's discussion with Silva Neves and was able to learn something new about this widely misunderstood notion of sex addiction and how it really works and what it really is. And if anybody in your life, or even you, is struggling with compulsive sexual behavior, certainly reach out to Silva for some support and follow him on Instagram and Twitter. Speaking of support, please, if you're enjoying The Erotic Philosopher, consider supporting us by following us on social media. We are at The Erotic Philos, PHILOS, on Instagram and Twitter. And you can also head on over to my website, that's cindydarnell.com, CyndyDarnell.com, where you will find the podcast tab for The Erotic Philosopher to leave a review for us on iTunes, where your reviews and ratings increase our visibility and make it easier for other people to find us. You'll also see a link on the podcast page to leave your questions for future erotic philosophers to ponder. While you're on my website, please check out my services and my online pleasure school, containing a suite of pre-recorded, ready-to-go, user-friendly, go at your own pace sex and relationship classes for adults of all genders and orientations. And while you're there, consider pre-ordering my new book coming out later this year, Sex When You Don't Feel Like It, The Truth About Mismatched Libido and Rediscovering Desire. As always, it's so wonderful to have you here joining me on The Erotic Philosopher, and I look forward to being with you again soon. Thanks for listening.